Thank you, Jesus. And thank you all for taking the time to come here this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here in Stockholm. I've been to Scandinavia several times, but never to Stockholm. And I got here this morning, and we walked around the city, saw the library, went to Scandia, we've seen things, and it's quite an incredible city as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to dive straight into my talk this evening. What I want to share with you is more the atmosphere of the place that I work from and work in. It's also something that has a work that has evolved. You know, it hasn't been a manifesto. There was never a plan. But this is something that has just sort of emerged through a process of doing. So I'm just going to take you through, general atmospheres that inspire us, that in some way form a communication. So the lecture is, interspaced with texts that are extremely important to me and to my practice and to the practice of my colleagues too. Quickly to put things in perspective, and this is just more an idea of where I started working when I came back from university in the US, spent 10 years abroad, worked in England for a few years, and then wanted to, not decide, wanted to return back home after a sort of long time from being away. But anyway, just to give you a sense of density and mass, where I work in a country with 1,200,000,000 people. Just for you to understand, more than half the population, that's 500 million people, build their own architecture. They don't go to you and me to make the built landscape. So what I observed when I went back to India was that more than 50% of what I saw as building or as built landscape was outside the framework of what you and I, or some of you who are studying here, are practicing to do. So that just gives you, and then also just the relationship in terms of water, in terms of climate, in terms of the relationship to time. So anyway, I'm going to quickly jump into the first text which you have read. A lot of the work, and I was talking to Jesus this afternoon, I'm interested in this idea of story and the idea of storytelling, and the fact that I think architecture in some way, what is contained within that is this act of storytelling in which I think that's where life is contained. So just very quickly, this text that I've had on the screen for some time, I'm sure you've read it, but I'll read it again. Lore, a body of traditions and knowledge on a subject or held by a particular group, typically passed from person to person by word of mouth. The second one, I think for me, is more particular with this idea. The space between the eye and the base of the bill of a bird, or between the eye and nostril of a snake. What's important for me here is this idea of navigation, of negotiation that occurs through the senses. And I think fundamentally, that's, I think, how all of us are made. So for me, it's important, this idea of communication, the idea of storytelling, the idea of energy that's transferred, that's passed on. It's sort of contained in this idea of the meaning of lore. So lore carries tacit knowledge through past, present, and future. Answers to each time lie in its appropriation. Most importantly, it is intuitive and rational, subjective and objective at the same time, essential both to the survival and nourishment of mankind. So for me, the interest and what I observed as opposed to discovered was that for me, the idea of making architecture is the capacity for a project to anticipate. And what I mean by anticipate, I mean by sitting latent, sitting possible for an opportunity that one can only imagine or can anticipate the possibility of that occurrence. So I'm just sharing a slide with you. It's a photograph taken a few years ago This is actually in the northwest part of the country in India. It's a desert, semi-arid landscape. This is a stone quarry which they mine red sandstone, and it normally doesn't rain there. But for me, it was just interesting that in March, which is not normally the time of the rain, this entire landscape was basically filled with rainwater, and the landscape was completely transformed in that moment for a brief period of time. So again, this is just a picture that I like, and I'm sharing that with you. But you see these little pavilions, they're actually built for shelter because there are no trees in this landscape. So just the same stones that are excavated, that are mined out for building, for all kinds of things. The people who work in these places actually put these structures. So there's about 100 of them, spread over the landscape. And as they keep moving, they just leave these structures behind. So in a way, anticipation of another possibility of another kind of civilization that might come upon it or add upon it. So I want to talk about this idea that, traditionally, and I'm not nostalgic about, tradition, but I think fundamentally, culturally, I think we all fundamentally come from this idea of lunar time, this idea of connection of time understood through the cycle of the waxing and waning of the moon. So what you have to understand is that culturally, in my country, we're still pretty much a large part of the population, and that's what I'm talking about is, a billion at least, are connected to this idea of lunar time. But we also have what is called Greenwich Mean Time, which was not so long ago. It's, a few hundred years old, came in when the seas were conquered. This was the idea of control and power, over the seas. And of course, that's the time that we all follow now. But if you go back into your own, culture of Scandinavia also, the moon was extremely important in the way that we resonated through time, through the seasons, through the year, through the month. So for me, this idea of movement, the idea of transfer, of resonance occurs through this understanding of lunar time. Again, it's quite interesting because, back home, and I'm sure if you've come across Indians here, or I'm sure you have, we have this sort of funny situation where, you'll ask a question and you get this kind of nod of the head, like this. And so you say, are you saying yes? And you'll get that again. And, is it maybe a no? I'm saying this because for me what's interesting is that it's not really the yes and it's not really the no. It's just the gesture of how things happen in between that moment of yes and no. Sometimes the head is kind of quite swift, sometimes a little slow. But a lot of things are exchanged, a lot of things are spoken in that movement, in this idea of, gestures. And the idea of, communication through the act of gestures becomes extremely an important aspect of the way that we develop things. So anyway, this particular slide I want to share with you because it really taps into this idea of the cycle of the moon. And I think intuitively this is somehow entered into the work that we do, or somehow been embedded in the work that we do. I wouldn't say it was not conscious, but something that was more tacit, which was more visceral, that entered the work. So anyway, you see these boats, they don't have any motors. If they did have motors, then they would need licenses, for them to operate. So this idea of the informal and the formal is what I'm calling. So Greenwich Mean Time as formal, lunar time as informal, just to give you a sense of things. And what they're doing is basically during the low tide, these boats actually go out into the estuary and they dredge the sand from the estuary. And they fill up these boats. They're run by fishermen. They're allowed to exist that way. They fill these boats up, and during the high tide, the boat comes back in. Okay, there's just the movement of the tide that allows or enables this transition to take place. And what you see is the next slide on the right is basically the same sand that is harvested is then taken on, and you can see the trucks, I think, further up there on the right. So this idea of how the transfer of time, how the transfer of cycle, and how they actually use a system of tidal flux in the construction of making cities. And so, of course, all the sand that you see that's being dredged here is carried there, then taken into the trucks, and then it enters into the cities for construction. So just to understand this idea of the flow, of how important really the foundations of what the city is really about. So I keep saying that, this idea of being built on an aqueous footing or an aqueous foundation becomes extremely important. This slide here on the left, and I'm interested in this moment, of course, of parallel cultures, parallel economies. And for me, the interest is not so much how divergent they are, but the moments where they potentially, for a brief moment in time, overlap, and then what comes from that moment of overlap, and again, for them to kind of move away. But this idea of these two aspects of culture that become really important. And for me, this particular slide, this idea of displacing time or the loss of origin becomes very critical in observing and in experiencing possibilities of how we can shape things. So for example, this particular image, there's the stair and the ramp. I think it's happening all over the world today, but more so in India. It's in the last 20 odd years, there's been a sort of economic juggernaut. There's a very rapid pace of movement of the economy that's growing at a fairly rapid pace. And you can see these sort of minor mutations or changes that take place in the front, the front facade of the street, for that matter. So the ramp's actually been introduced, this ramp, because a motorcycle now has become a pride of place. And every evening a motorcycle is actually brought into the living room of the house and kept there as like a piece of, it's a pride possession. But for me, what's interesting is that when you observe this object, right, there's a moment where you don't quite know which one came first. This sort of coexist, and so this seamless overlap of how the two actually come together to make this thing. And the way that it's, articulated, the manner behind it, there's a gesture that accommodates both these cultures very seamlessly, and how that physically is manifested for me, this is architecture. This other slide I like, it's in a place called Hampi in the south of India, a city that's been built out of just one material, then that's granite. It was built in the 15th century, not so long ago for us at least. But anyway, I had taken this picture several years ago, and I really didn't know, I just took the picture just out of interest. And what I discovered, much later on, was that these holes that you see were actually punctured, where little pieces of wood were driven in, like wedges were driven in, water's poured onto the wood expands and then splits the rock. Simple device, and for me, the idea of economy of means, this idea of gesture and movement, and how with the most minimum tools, just, this idea of water, this idea of material, the idea of flux, fluctuation, how that can basically, it's like a tectonic plate or a tectonic shift, which just in this simple act, an entire city is built. So anyway, that's something that for me is quite interesting. So this is a 2,000-year-old practice. This video has been taken very recently, 6 months ago. Two tools. You see the metal chisel and the hammer. So this entire quarry has been basically excavated by just these two tools over a period of time. 4 families that run this quarry, and the entire quarry has been harvested. You see no machinery, nothing, and this still exists even till date. The reason I want to share this with you is that this aspect of, we're losing things, things are lost, and for me, I'm of the view that nothing is lost, it's only obscured in time. That's it. It's a question of how that can be drawn out. But here you can see basically the thickness of the hole. It's like maybe 200 millimeters deep, and they go about with a little hammer and check They understand the sound of the quarry. They make these holes, and they make several of them. Just by the action of the hammer, putting the chisel in. And there's a moment when all the holes are made, and they connect the holes again by tapping it with the chisel. And there's a moment when the entire thing just splits open and cracks, and just releases that 200 millimeters of surface, from the ground. And for me, that's the moment, that's the first act of where architecture is made. Now, just something that I'm presenting to you, and the reason I'm interested in this is because these possibilities, at least where I come from, still exist. And so I got interested in this idea of a tilt up, like paper, like when you cut paper and you tilt something up, you could pretty much make a drawing at full scale in the quarry, taking a line, a blue line, blue chalk line. You do that when you construct. The first action that you make is you sort of pick the line, and it makes the mark. So you could pretty much make a full-scale drawing, and at a very simple gesture of something that sits with no space, suddenly just by their action and by this moment, you can basically build an entire city by this very simple gesture. So anyway, I'm just presenting situations for me which are interesting and outside the idea of economy as we know it, outside the idea of industry as we know it. This other image here, I was buying these pitchforks, perfect representation of the hand. It's an agrarian tool, evolved and developed over a period of time, and it's very precise. It's as good, it is the hand itself. But anyway, so I'm sitting there, I've been talking to this gentleman in the yellow t-shirt, and I'm talking to him, and I'm saying to him, how come you're the only one here with this yellow t-shirt? Because it's a dry area. They normally wear this, white linen, cotton top, and what you see as pants are really basically a cloth that's tied. We call it a dhoti. But anyway, I'm talking to him, and so I ask him, how come you're the only one here with this yellow t-shirt? And he says, we get these traveling salesmen, and they give these t-shirts out for free. They're advertising, la-di-da-di-da, whatever it might be. And that's how we get. So I couldn't really argue with him. It's cotton, it works, in the climate, and it's for free, more importantly. So anyway, and then, we continue a conversation, and then I soon exchange money with him. And the next thing I know is his hand goes into his t-shirt, and I'm like, wow, how did you do that? So he kind of looks up at me with that, naughty, wry smile, and says that, I took it home and my wife cut it up. Kind of like a Lucio Fontana cut on a canvas, and stitched this beautiful pink satin lining pocket. And I call him the pocket man. But for me, the reason I'm sharing this is this idea of prejudice, this idea of that what I'm seeing is an act of a lack of prejudice. Basically, what seems, for most of us as a closed space, as a system that's basically coming upon you, at a speed and a rate of change which in some ways is non-negotiable, I think it's a lack of prejudice that allows the opening of a space that one did not see before. But for me, what's important is the idea that both of them can coexist. So there's no judgment here about right and wrong and good and bad, but the possibility, and it just comes from a very simple, I don't want to call it a function, but the act of retaining, one's own sensibility. So if you notice below, he still wears the linen cloth that's wrapped around. So he needs a shirt that carries the pocket like his uncle or his cousin or whatever who you see on the left side. So for me, this particular slide, talks about the idea of, judgment, prejudice, and things that we carry with us, which I think in some ways disables us from this possibility of potential overlap. But anyway, so these are words that, we've sort of formulated. I think we've used several different dictionaries, but kind of made it our own. And you'll see them kind of running through the lecture. But this is a constant work that takes place. So this dictionary slowly just is getting, thicker and thicker, but just words at a certain point in time that suggest a quality of space or suggest something. But so anyway, posture. The word comes from the Latin verb ponere, which means to put or place, to observe this concept implies an implicit understanding of the carriage of the body as a whole, its approach, attitude, or the positioning of the arms and legs in relation to the object which is being manipulated. So I call this particular slide Postures in Architecture, and it's quite interesting for me because we were in 2010, the same Biennale that Jesus was talking about, and we had to do this black screeded floor. We went, to the local contractors that were appointed by the Biennale, and they came back the next day with a can of paint and said, this is what we can do for you. And we said, okay, no, this is not what we want, and we kind of thought about it. I was there with my 8 carpenters, me 9, and there was a young intern at that time, Sam, who was, from the US. So anyway, we kind of looked at each other and said, okay, how are we going to do this? So the carpenters basically, they're not masons, and it was kind of work that requires, a mason to do. But he said, we've watched them work, and we've seen how they work. And what really was involved in that was that you kind of had to sit down on the ground, like on your haunches, on your 2, down, and kind of work the floor, work that for a couple of hours. I tried to make it down, as you saw just now. I could barely make it down to the floor, let alone sit. Sam didn't even make it halfway, through his knees. And of course, the carpenters basically worked their way through for maybe 3 or 4 hours, pretty much through the whole thing, and produced the floor. So I'm raising the question, and that's when it struck me that maybe it's not the technique, it's not the material, it's got nothing to do with that. All of that is there. So I'm putting this question to you that, what if the postures that we take, in the postures that we take, things are obscured in time. They're not necessarily lost, but they're obscured in time. And I'm using posture as a very broad idea here. But again, for me, what's interesting about this slide is not this or this, but actually what lies in there. What's the space here in between? Is this space? Is this space? You can see it's that space. Here, all fours, hands and feet. It's a complete cycle where everything is connected. Mind, body, spirit, it's all connected. And that was the conversation we were having just now at coffee, where I was talking about the idea that, this idea of embodied energy and what that means. But one of the things I spoke about to Jesus, and this was a discovery made, just something that I observed a few years ago, that also partly because, the nature of my practice is considered to be handmade and handmaking. And honestly speaking, that's not my motivation. It's not, that's not the basis of why or how we do the work. It's something that happened because half the time, through the day where I had a studio, so 8 hours or 9 hours, I had no electricity, which meant that we still had to produce and work. And that was partly why we had to engage with very minimum things that we had, basically our hands and tools, and we still had to produce, and I think the work kind of emerged from that. But what I want to share with you is that the first thing that touched us, it was not the eyes, it was not the sound, but the first gesture that actually touched everybody, every living person on this planet, was actually the hands. That was the moment of transfer that took place when we actually came into being. And for me, what's important was the empathy, affection, and manner in which we were brought in. That's the gesture. For me, that's the importance of the capacity of what we can translate or what we can transmit through these hands. And I think that's the idea, that the processes are very much there, and it's just maybe in just the way that we sit, the way we stand, the postures we take, be it economy, be it politics, that in some way obscures methods of making that still actually are all around us. Water, air, and light. Water, a colorless, transparent, odorless liquid which forms the seas, lakes, rivers, and rain and is the basis of fluids of living organisms. Air, the invisible gaseous substance surrounding the earth, a mixture mainly of oxygen and nitrogen. Light, the natural agent that stimulates sight and makes things visible. So I'm going to go into the projects, and I was talking about seasonal flux, tidal flows. So this is actually a project, it's a multi-generation family house. That means there are 3 families from the same family. They're, grandparents, the ones in between, and the younger ones, but they're all, so it's a kind of large family. This was a site, and again, importantly, for example, 500 million people, unlike most of us here, we turn on the tap and water comes to us, right? But or large part of the population back in India go to the source of water, be it a river, be it a stream, be it a lake, or be it a well. And that practice of going back and forth to the water source is also like a ritual. There's an understanding of an environment that surrounds that water source. And so based on the seasonal fluxes, the water then is accordingly used and shared. And this is something that is nurtured and developed, and even for a large population like ours, and we do have issues of water. I think they're all, this problem exists pretty much everywhere, but somehow there's a negotiation of how one deals with it. So you're really reliant, you have to be self-reliant in some ways to the livelihood or to the nourishment of one's own self. So anyway, here, this is an excavation on a site which for me formed the belly button, about 20 feet, which would be about 5-6 meters down into the ground is sweet water. We're barely about 25-30 meters from the ocean or from the sea. The saltwater table is what keeps the sweet water, over the diaphragm. So anyway, the project, and this particular person here on the left is a master well builder. So I work with a lot of people that come from this informal, they're informally trained, if you want to call it, because their training has come from being passed on from generation to generation to generation. Apparently my carpenters would tell me, oh, we're 20 generations in our lineage. So I say, let's cut it in half and say, let's keep it at 10. That's still a lot. So pretty much, be it all kinds of people, even now, even till date, you will come across, people with the capacity of what they know within their, I would say, their body and mind and their hands. This incredible sort of lineage of passing on. So anyway, this is a master well builder on the left, the gentleman with the cap. You can see he's got these crutches because at a very young age, he nearly lost his life in what he basically spent, the rest of his life mastering something that took his life. He took that on and actually mastered that. Again, it's more a science that comes from being very perceptive. So he was able to sort of articulate the fissure in the ground, the size of the opening through which water came through into that excavation. It was very important that we keep that very, we straddle that, or we build something like an arch so that over time that fissure, which is barely that much, doesn't get compressed because of gravity and time, by being pushed down. Because that's when the salt water would basically come into the water source. So anyway, this is the community that's working, putting the whole thing together. That's the first thing that we did. So in some way, it's the foundation. The gesture of the project is kind of, I want to say it's like this, where this is the house, and the belly button is what it protects. So everything is done to, in some way, protect and nourish the source that actually feeds the inhabitants of that space. So this was a drawing that was done actually way after the project, but that's not important. It kind of gives you a section. And this one here is actually taken in the monsoons. And this is something I want to share with you. So it's full moon, high tide, and heavy rain, which means that the water cannot actually recede or go back out to the sea or the ocean. And this tank actually fills up all the way to the top with water. And it's just barely for that brief period of 4 hours that this phenomena exists. And it pretty much happens, almost every year or every other year. But for me, what's important here also is that these are actually where light, air, and water pass through. There's no glass. It's basically a seamless space with the outside. This is taken in the summer. For me, what was interesting out here was what I discovered, and I think that's what for me was important, was that I think we operate a lot with our visual, with the eyes. And this was the first time for me, a discovery and an observation that, being so close to the ocean, the view of the ocean is taken away. But the presence of the sea was so present, and you can see that from this registration here. So this picture was maybe taken 2 hours after high tide, and you can see the marking of the tide. So in some ways, this container or vessel it clocks the time. You can see the flux, the change of the sea, and you can feel the presence of the ocean without actually physically seeing it. And that was quite important, that idea of, or the gesture of where outside is actually inside. This idea of what is exterior and interior, or interiority and exteriority, and how they can interchange. It's not this idea of physical, where oftentimes it's the visual that we connect, but here it was more a visceral connection of this idea of interior and exterior, which were both present at the same time. Again, I was sharing this with you, connecting it back to the story of this idea of lunar time, tidal flux. And it was through making of these projects that these observations became more apparent, and they sort of entered, deeper into our practice. So that's the plan. That was the gesture that I demonstrated. These are the openings that you see there. And for me, what's important is that at some point in time, this periphery will come down. 50 years, whatever, 60 years, maybe less, maybe more. But it's a matter of time when that will slowly. But for me, what is important in what we do is that we have the capacity to impregnate, to leave something behind. And this idea that one leaves a source of nourishment to a civilization that has not been formed yet. So to anticipate the possibility of how this resource, or how one can leave behind a resource for other generations, to in some way overlay and work from. So I think that opportunity is afforded in every work, or every of every situation that is available to us, that moment of intervention when one can actually leave something behind in a way that can nourish a life source. Okay, so this is a house. I call this house a house that was designed to relieve the anxieties of the site, and I sort of say that in many broad ways. It's a single family house. Again, similar in the way that we would start a project, this idea of, self-reliance, economy of means, the gestures that we make through the seasons. This is a picture taken in March. It's the time when the water table is at its lowest. So that's when you dig the well. Because if you dig it at any other time, you might register the wrong height or the wrong depth to the well. And you basically have a month and a half to actually dig and build the project. And we have these water diviners, that's why I call it divinity. This young 13-year-old who walks around with a coconut in his hand, stops and tells you, this is the spot, so much water. And he's been right 9 times out of 10. So anyway, for me, this idea of cut and fill, this idea of balance becomes extremely important. Oftentimes in the work that we do, for me, what's important is that the less the movement of things that come from the outside. So let's say if I took the 4 walls of this, it's basically displacing what's within this periphery or what's within the framework, because at a certain point we're changing the status quo, or we're changing the status quo of the site, something that has been impacted over time, over hundreds of years. But this idea of displacement, that, changing of weight, you take mass from here and you move it somewhere else. So anyway, this is action that's taken place in the monsoon. That's the clearing, because it was a mango orchard. This was a rice field. This was the place that was available to build. And the movement is barely 50 meters away. So and I'll show it to you in plan. So that's the well. And it's a good maybe 50, 60 meter distance. The earth is moved here by hand, so there was no machinery. It was fairly straightforward. We do have hands, at our disposal back at home, but I don't think the issue was more how to negotiate through that landscape of trees and vegetation and flora and fauna. But what I want to share with you is that this had to happen before the rains. So we actually we dug, we found water, we found earth was displaced, and then the 4 months of the monsoon, we used the rain to basically compact the earth. Now, if I miss this time cycle, basically there's more money, more effort, more energy, and lots of trouble. You know, it's just in this idea of working in a specific way where I tap into a seasonal cycle or a seasonal flow, that actually work happens without, you know, it's the path of least resistance that basically enables for situations like this to exist. Anyway, these are instruments, I call these instruments of communication. These are, so to speak, working drawings where you can see, you know, full-scale mock-ups, a model that you can actually go and measure. You know, so there are all these things that in some way connect and make and build a story, you know, these fragments of things. But particularly why we work this way was, A, it's much quicker because you could sit making drawings, you know, for months on ends. And the same question will be basically asked to you, you know, after 6 months. So here, what's important is that we're able to engage in a conversation through the process of making. And everybody who is involved in it, be it the clients, be it the people making it, be it myself, or other people like you who would come in and be able to quite easily participate without really knowing what the work is, just because of the tools or the instruments that are available for you to connect with. So these are our working drawings. And again, it's interesting if you note that I think if I leave it as an instruction, that means, you know, this has to be, you know, 1 meter wide, 60 centimeters deep, mistake. Because for what I discovered was that we make drawings, but we don't put dimensions oftentimes on the drawings. What it means is the person making it has to actually take a scale or take something and go there, measure it, and then take it. And this kind of back and forth, there's a rhythm that's developed in terms of the way the exponential, sort of, I would call it kind of like fractals, you know, the idea of measurements, the resonance of measurements, or tolerance of measurements. So these are actually drawings made by my carpenters, and they're involved right from the onset of the project. So what's interesting is that finally, while making it, they just know the project. You know, they don't really even need to, at a certain point, they don't even need to look at anything anymore. They're already engaged, they're involved, they can participate, and that's when it's immediate. That's when the actions that take place in what's being made is not pre-decided or premeditated. You know, there's a framework, there's an idea, there's a suggestion, and then the action takes place. Yeah, so these basically are our working drawings. So that's the side. You can see it's quite dense with these large trees. This has been backed up because I actually use the monsoons, because the foliage here, the leaves get much larger, and most of the house here has no glass. It's basically porous. Air, light can pass through seamlessly, and what's important is the house is kind of tucked into the foliage. So in a way, my back towards, you know, the wind and the rain. And in the monsoons, of course, this whole area gets dense and in some way then protects the house from really heavy winds. Again, here in the monsoon, basically, there's that same situation of, you know, full moon, high tide, and no rain, and actually the water fills up. And I'll show it to you in some other slides later. So these are the rooms, the private rooms upstairs. These are the rooms below. I mean, I don't want to really talk about the plan so much. But for me, what's interesting about the plan is that when the husband and wife have a fight, you know, they have the ability to escape each other on the roof and sort of go out and enter there and, you know, play this sort of hide and seek game if they want to, or then make up from the 2 different rooms that they've escaped to. But anyway, this idea that the roof also becomes part of the project, where they're able to make that into a new ground, which you can see. So that moment where there's full moon, high tide, that water level comes up to here, and it kind of suggests being on a boat in a way. And if, you know, if the water level comes up even higher, then they can escape up to the roof. And if it gets even more delicate than that, then they can run away from the house. But that's a separate thing. That's the cross section. That was the excavation. That's the fill. The rest of the ground is held the way it is. this water table, this stream, monsoon stream increases, forms a datum line, and then 4 hours later, basically recedes back to the ground. I've not had the chance to experience that, but I think someday soon, a lot of people from my studio have had that opportunity. I've not, but anyway, from them I know that this situation happens. So you can see there's a crane pushing the stone from outside, and these guys are pulling it. So anyway, this was the moment of that yes and no, and I'll... So it's really funny because when the house was complete, every day when I walked into the house and the owners were there, I'd have this frown on my forehead. And she'd ask me, every time I've watched you, that every time you walk through the front door, you have this frown on your forehead. And she said, what's the problem? So I said, there's something heavy that needs to come here. And this was something that I had right from the beginning. I didn't know what, why, how. And so at that moment, she said, by the way, my mom's doing some building work in the south, and there are these rocks that are coming out while she's digging. Should I ask her to send some? So I said, sure. And then I leave the site, and a month and a half later, I get this very panicked phone call. Bijoy, the truck has come, and there's a 5-ton rock in the truck. So I told her, whatever it is, you don't come to site. You don't go to the house today. I immediately went that evening, rustled up all the people that we were working. We went and tried to locate a guy with a crane, because I knew I had just that little window to get this rock into the house. Now, you would normally ask me, why did you not take the crane? Super easy. Pick up the rock, take the crane, put it over, and it's there. We were having the conversation, and so I said, do you think we'll be able to make it through? And so I get this kind of nod of the head, yes, yes, yes. Bad idea, because chances are they'll say yes, 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 pick the rock up, and the rock's going to be released on the roof. I said, I'm not having any of this. These things happen back where I come from. So that was the best way, was to sort of bring this rock in. But I want to share this with you, really. The idea of the rock is basically what it's doing is actually pushing the water from rising up. That's the suggestion, really. And that's the rock actually in some way absorbs all the energy of the site. And when I started these slides, I said it's what actually relieves the anxiety of the site. The only one whose anxiety is not relieved is the lady of the house. Otherwise, the dog, the son, the husband, the friends, aunts, they're all very happy with the rock being in the house. But anyway, for me, this idea, so the house will go away in time, it will sort of disappear. What remains is this moment of energy that you basically, this relationship that you see, that's what remains. Kind of like a foundation for you, for someone else to build from again. So this is my studio, part of my studio. It's now in Mumbai, city of 22 million people. All this, what you see in these images are in the last, I would say, 10 years, 12 years at best. And if you come, every 6 months, there's sort of a rapid change. The skyline is changing, and this is really what the experience is like. That's the site right there. Along the railway tracks, it's the old part of the city. This was an old tobacco factory. The roof burnt down. These trees basically grew once the roof had been burnt down. And we have the zoo, which is across the railway tracks. It's about a big tract of land and green, and there are these bats that fly over this, and it's the bat droppings that basically allowed this vegetation to take place. So anyway, it's a kind of mixed-use project where it's live and work. I have a studio. There's a studio of another designer that works here. There's a lawyer. There's 5, 6 different kinds of people doing different things, and each of us basically, So for me, what was important was to develop a typology that was equanimous to east, west, north, south. That was equanimous to ground, sky, and earth. And so what was important was it was not based then on whether you were on the railway tracks, on the road, near the building, near the garden. What became important was a typology that was universal, and the quality of the experience shared in that typology was the same. Here we had to take the roofs inwards, because if we took the roofs outside, the neighbors would get affected. And of course, I don't want to get into this terrain of what's allowed and what's not allowed. These are things that just exist, and you have to just accept them for the fact that they exist. The moment you try and disrupt this situation, the possibility of actually making the project won't occur. So in some ways, you allow them to be there. And what meant that if we did the roof like this, all the water would basically go out, and that didn't make sense because we didn't have the tolerance, or we didn't have the space to be able to move the water on the outside. So that's what suggested us to sort of take the roof and sort of turn it on the inside. So anyway, let me go through it. I call this, like a South American flute. That's the corridor or the alleyway that takes you through. And for me, it's more the sound of the light more than the sight of the light, that the light has a particular quality of sound. So when you walk through, just the natural gesture as you're walking through, you're immediately drawn to these spaces inside. So there's a sort of, each one has a kind of different rhythm. And that's why I call it that Amazonian flute, with the sort of a different lines with different sounds. And that's the sort of suggestion of this particular plan. Constellation, a group of stars on the celestial sphere, forming a pattern traditionally named after its apparent form. An assemblage, collection, or group of usually related entities. So these are drawings that I was telling you about, one of the other methods of drawings. It's called a tape drawing. It's basically masking tape on a very thin sheet of plywood. Normally in the monsoons, we have like a 99% humidity, even in Mumbai, but where we used to work. And so the carpenters kind of, sneakily developed this. I call it sneakily being the operative word. Because when we would, print our drawings, by the end of 4 months, you would basically have nothing. There were shreds, basically. So they started making these drawings on the sheets, very thin sheets of rejected sheets of plywood. And it was very efficient because you just roll out masking tape. Masking tape is paper. They do this, and then they would directly draw on it. Now, the wonderful thing with this is you can basically move in dimension. You can do full-scale drawings, that is 1:1, and you can do, sort of smaller drawings, if you want to call it. And they're planar in some sense. So when you make all the elevations, you can actually start looking and examining them in 3D. Now, you can notice these drawings are actually made by the people building the project. No dimensions, nothing. And they would keep going back and forth to measure. But what I wanted to share with you was, it was quite, so of course, I asked my head carpenter, I said, surely this must cost a lot of money to buy all this plywood. And he kind of looks up at me and says, I knew you'd ask me that question. So he says, by the time you call the guy to fix the printer, you buy the ink and do all of that, it's far more expensive, taking a print than making one of these drawings. And it's kind of now become a standard drawing method. And what's wonderful about this drawing method is that any one of us can actually engage on day one. You don't need a skill. It's once you just observe someone doing it, it's super easy. So a lot of young kids who kind of join the studio, who actually they're just beginning to study architecture, sort of now start making these drawings quite simply. This is my own home. What I like is this idea that it actually rains in the center of the house. So in the monsoons, that courtyard space, I'm actually indoors. and it's actually raining inside the main space of the house. This is my studio. I have partly an art and architectural practice. I don't want to call it one or the other because both of them inform each other. And so it's just experiments in material studies, on all kinds of things like that. But yeah, that's our workspace. Okay, I'm going to be quick. Gravity, the force that attracts a body towards the center of the earth or towards any other physical body having mass. So I started building in brick at a certain point, recently actually, 5 years ago. I had about 200 people at some point and they left over a period of time. The studio changed, shrunk. And I used to always say this, that the resources that are available to me are available to everybody else, pretty much back at home, but also I think here in Europe too. But we basically started, if you think about it, that if you say 500 million people know how to build their own projects or build their own house, let's cut that down to 250 million. Let's take that down to 100 million. I'm saying I still have 100 million bricklayers to my disposal, and that's going to take some time to go through before it's completely eroded, of course, unless the material disappears. So brick became a natural choice for building just because those are the resources that were available. There's an economy to it. It's fairly inexpensive. And I think you've also had that kind of construction here in Europe. I think a large part of Europe, in the early days was built like that. So these are just experiments. These bricks are actually fired. These are brick kilns. And so we went back to study the origin of how bricks are made. But we started making them in the studio, like tiny bricks like that. And these images that you see are kilns that you can really fire. And what this did was basically the models that we made, we were building a real brick wall. So the connection, the corners, it was all there in building it, just in the act of building it, whoever was building it. So this was really something that we practice, and we continue to practice. We continue to do these exercises for ourselves, and just in terms of developing a relationship, this idea of, things that are exchanged in that process of making. So this is a project, this is in Ahmedabad. It's a site where 40 wild peacocks live. And it's again a multi-generation family house. For me, what was important here, having observed the peacocks, and I knew that if we had trucks rolling in and out, the potential or possibility that the natives or the peacocks of this land would possibly leave because that site was now being disturbed. And they're quite sensitive in that sense with that kind of movement. So what we decided was basically the excavation that we created for the foundations. It's basically sand. We use that as a building material. So in some ways, no truck came in and no truck left. All the material, 80% of the material or 85% of the material is actually built using the resources of what was excavated from the foundation. So that idea of, again, cut and fill, that idea of balance or rebalance that occurs. So these are bricks that are compressed with a little bit of lime and cement to kind of hasten the process. That's the plan. There are 3 houses, 1, 2, 3, and connected by that central court, because every month they have an occasion where there are at least 50, 60, 70 people, sometimes more. Since it's a large family, and again in India, families are quite large, so that becomes a very important part of for at least for this particular family as a sort of meeting point. But also importantly, I always give places where they can escape. So if the sons want to escape the parents, they can, or somebody wants to hide from someone, they can. But anyway, that's a little game that goes on. So you can see all the material basically was what came out of the foundations. The swimming pool actually, or the water tank, if you want to call it, that actually takes the color of the peacock, and that's the only one that registers in the similar sort of donation that you see. Again, for me, it was important here that at a certain point, the inhabitants of the house would leave, maybe 50 years from now, maybe 30 years from now, and the house could be reclaimed back by the peacocks. The 40 peacocks can once again come back, settle in. They never left. They still continue to inhabit the periphery. And from time to time, they come in to the courtyard. Sometimes, in the morning, they do this dance and they leave. So for me, the entire project really was really based on developing it for the peacocks. Okay, quickly, this is a project in China. I'm often asked, what would you do? So this was like developing a project, going from 0 to 60, 0 to 200 in 6 seconds flat. That was the kind of jump that we had to do in terms of projects that we were doing. So these are 270-story buildings in China. I don't know if they're built yet, but we made the proposals for them. I'm going to very quickly go through this. So this idea of surface and tattoo, and what I want to share with you is that if you imagine this idea of landscape, be it the Amazon, be it the desert, this idea of the importance of tattoo, or this idea of marking, if you can visualize yourself as someone naked in that kind of landscape without a mark on the body, there's no way to engage. Your sense of place in some way is displaced. What these tattoos do is give a sense of expression. So anyway, we're using this gesture of the body as the tower and using the surface, which is defined in very particular ways that define the idea of interface between interiority and exteriority. So these are just projects that we looked at. These are what I call them as running balconies. You actually enter through the facade of the building and enter into the room. So you always enter through the facade and leave the building through the facade. Very quickly, for me, the most important part of this project was actually here, right there. That's the zone. So you actually enter this building. It's fairly straightforward. This is the vertical stack. You can see which takes, the elevators and all of that. But internally, you basically have these stairs. And I call it like a snakes and ladders game. I think we've all played snakes and ladders, right? If you get to the top where the snake with his mouth, you kind of go back down to the tail. But yeah, this idea that there's this different kind of movement. But what's more important is that the facade is actually activated through the time of the day. And you get a sense of life by the way that the facade is occupied. So in some ways, this, few meters is really like the veranda, the meeting point, but you always enter and exit via that face, via that facade. So that's really the gesture of these. So there were 2 towers that we developed. Affection, it is the ability to observe and to identify with another situation or condition, and to then care for it and protect it, in the hope to provide it with what it needs to be itself. For me, this is really a very important aspect, this idea of affection, empathy, the idea of how you can embody something with the energy based on these sort of nuances. This is a project in the north of India. It's a weaver's complex. What happened here? So it's a Japanese woman who came to me and said, I want to make a project in the way that I actually make my textiles. And she basically harvests pretty much the land, be it the dyes, be it the insects, be it the bark of a tree, be it the indigo that's growing in her fields. Everything is basically resource. So all her material basically emerges from the earth and returns back to the earth. So that was basically the precondition that she gave me in hiring me for this project. Anyway, you can see here this diagram on the left. And for me, this diagram is more this idea of a gesture, which basically the idea of receiving the moon on the chest is this sort of arms open with the idea of the chest. And it's illogical, it does not make sense, but we all have these situations. You go to a site the first time, and it's another conversation that we're having, and the project in some ways already taken place. The site hasn't really informed me about the project. This is something that's processing. It's that moment where the 2 things come together and something is created at that moment. And for me, that's the concept, that's the seed. Everything is done after that to nourish that seed. And for me, that concept is really what I care about at the end of the day in the project. That's all I want to experience. Everything else supports the creation of that experience. Anyway, so this is a line drawing. My clients are here. We're doing the gestures. So you can see they're already engaging in the act of drawing and making the building. So in some way, you begin to live this project from day one. And some of them are there. The gentleman here on the right, the lady, she's somewhere in the distance. But anyway, that's sort of making a map or making a plan of the project. This is quite interesting. That's that heart receiving the moon. So I was there on day one at the site, and I was talking, and I sat down on this rock, and I said, and it was the time of full moon, and the moon came up from behind the hill, and I said, this is where we'll build, this tank of water. I did not know why and what were the reasons, but of course 3 or 4 years later from the time we started and we built the project. What's interesting is we see a double moon rising. So you see the moon rising from the east, coming up above the hills, and 15 minutes later, you see the same moon again as a reflection in the water tank. I'm putting this question forward. Is light being emitted from the ground or from the sky? Just something for you to think about. Another thing that for me is of interest is that the sky is a mirror reflection of the earth. That for every living organism, there are that many stars out there. Now we require distance for us to be able to observe, because if anything is too close up to us, we don't have the capacity to see. So in my view, there's language. If we are able to understand the sky, we're able to understand the ground. There's language being written all the time. And it's sort of, tuning into this idea of language that's being written by the environment. Again, it's not something that you have to learn. It's something that you have to flow into. It's something that, and it takes place with this idea of observation, of letting go, of immersing oneself in that possibility. And it's only if you ask this question. I mean, for me, the sky is extremely important. I look up and I can, there's things out there that one is able to look at. And our ancestors have proven to us that that's what has guided us to bring us to where we are today. So that's the plan, that's the main workshop, that gesture that I talked about. The moon rises from here, from behind the mountains. Of course, it's not there in the model. This is the dining room, that's the dining facilities, these are the residents out here, and that's the gallery out here. And what's interesting is that this tract of land, basically, that's the agriculture part. So it's kind of a warp and weft, where the agriculture enters into the site, and this, what is being colonized, enters into the agriculture. They interlock with each other. That's the beginning of construction. The earlier video that you saw with the guy, plowing the fields, that was the day one when my client actually impregnated the fields with indigo, and the construction was going on at the same time. I don't know why that video doesn't work, but it's not important. Anyway, so all the material here was harvested basically from a good maybe half an hour's radius. So all the material that was used to build this project is basically stone, bricks, lime, and a little bit of timber, but fundamentally it's stone, brick, and lime. That's it. These are the three materials. And most of it was harvested from the region itself. I like this particular slide because I'm showing you, the idea of erosion that takes place, this idea of time, and how it's this kind of like this idea of archaeology, where it kind of reveals something latently sitting inside the ground. So you can see that's the excavation that's taking place, and these rocks are actually things that are actually coming out of the ground. Now it's in the Himalayas, it's in the lower part of the Himalayas. And this idea that through the cycle of the rains, through the cycle of the rivers that flow through, there's this sort of erosion that's taking place. And by that erosion, every year, this idea of something that slowly is emerging from the ground. There are traces, there are things, there are marks that one can discover. So the project in some way really follows the forces or the flows that are there on the site itself, and you allow those flows to in some way inform what actually is embedded on the land itself. You can see the plan, and you can see you can't really see the contours, but the gesture of how this opens up. So it's really a square, but it's kind of just opened up because of the thrust of the contours that are on this side here. So that's the agriculture part that comes right through. And you can see these channels out here that you can see in the plan that return back to the fields. And I'll show you some pictures later. So indigo is harvested from here, brought here, put into vats, made into dyes. You know, the thread is pulled out from silkworms. What I want to share with you is this idea of the ability of the hand. So the people actually building this project, they come from the eastern part of the country, from Bengal. And their family for generations has basically cultured silkworms, silk cocoons. And the silk is very famous from this particular. So we were having dinner, my client was there, these young boys who were actually building the project were there, and I kind of asked them a very simple question, just asked them, where are you guys from? I kind of knew where they were from. And he kind of said, we're from Malda. And my client just, perked up and said, I've been wanting to go to Malda for 20 years. But what I'm sharing with you is the bricklayers, right? These guys lay bricks. The same guys know how to pull a silk thread. The same guys know how to rear a silk cocoon, that is, look after a silkworm, from understanding the mulberry fields to feeding it. That's the bandwidth of what they carry within themselves. If you understand this idea of dimension, the same guys can do both those things, in the same day itself. And there is no problem in terms of moving from one to the other. I'm just saying that's the capacity, that's the ability that we have. I'm not saying we have back there, we have in general. So yeah, those are the silk cocoons that you see. And they're about, I think, 100 meters long if you just pull the thread. One of these cocoons produces a thread that's 100 meters long. But for me, what's important here about the project was that if you imagine 4 acres of land, and all 4 acres of the land, every grain of sand has been touched by the hand more than once. At this point, I'm not interested in the architecture anymore because I just know it intuitively that the moment the ability for the hand to just go over the land like that, it will resonate with a certain kind of energy. It is just implicit to that action. So for me at that point, architecture kind of becomes secondary itself. It's the whole act of making that becomes more important than the architecture itself. Manner, from the French manière, substantivized use of the adjective meaning done with one's hands. A notion which reveals a method of execution or a way of doing, especially with regards to the outward manifestation of an embodied process. Again, that was my old studio 5 years ago. And you can see that's all the stuff that we have that in some way, it also helps us understand the work, understand the project. And those are actually all the bricks and the stuff that we've made, and that's how we got involved in this whole act of making. So in some way, even if we didn't build the real project, the project is for real in the studio. These models can be kept out just like the real thing. They can weather in time. They can do all of those activities. And this is something very important for me. So there's never a sense of loss if something doesn't get built. It's always there. It's always immediate. And one can continue to observe the cycles of time acting on these things. So that's, I think, part of the reason also why these things have emerged in the way that we work. Every surface, every wall, every floor, the fields, everything has been actually done this way. And it's something that I only observed much later through the act of building the project. So it's quite interesting how all the people that were there were actually invested in the work itself. So in some ways, it became a far more inclusive, diverse environment that's actually embodied in the architecture itself. So that's interesting, actually. This roof is made out of marble. And just to share with you, if I had to do this with plywood, it would cost me the same money. No, I'm being very serious. So it's kind of interesting because that's why I said these are fluxes, things that are happening. And there's a moment like it's a window that you might be able to find where you can actually engage in something, just by the opportunity of economics, location, transfer, all those kind of forces. And there's a moment where you can actually harness this kind of material. So yeah, it's the same. The cost per square meter or cost per square foot is exactly the same as a sheet of plywood. But that's not important. That was not really the reason what motivated the project. That's the dyeing facilities out here. And this room there in the back is like the temple, so to speak. The indigos dyed here. This is the lady, and that's the indigo fields. But what I want to share with you, that's the indigo being dyed. It's a trabeated system of stone columns and beams and brick walls. These are stone slabs. This method, it's kind of using basically the same kind of system of timber joinery. So you actually can do the same thing with stone. So there are dovetail joints and very complex joints, but actually using stone as a material. That's what I wanted to share with you, was this particular, that's the indigo that's being washed because of the textiles that are being washed. And the same indigo basically returns back to the field, to the origin of where it actually came from. And so over a period of time, you'll get these stripes of reds and yellows and oranges and blues that will kind of mark these. So in a sense, as time passes by, the entire land is actually a textile in some way, just in the way that these things are being produced in this place. This is actually called the elephant entrance, right here. And it's been calibrated for a full-grown elephant to walk through. No, I'm very serious. The reason I'm saying this is because we're right at the edge of a forest. And actually there's a large, it's a huge forest, and there's a large population of elephants. And so we've also planted trees, especially in the courtyard, where these particular orange flowers, when they blossom and they fall to the ground, they've got a very strong scent to it, and they attract the elephants. And the elephants basically, eat this and get a bit high. But they really enjoy this. But so this opening has actually been made in the hope that that's when boundaries can be basically taken down, and we can enable. It's just, again, this idea of house for peacocks. It's a space for the elephants. And for me, the interest lies in how do we basically, in some ways, suggest these boundaries that potentially can be dropped, and for these possibilities to come back or to return back into the way that we understand culture of our time. Self-reliance. We are interested in the notion of self-reliance and its capacity to holistically encompass all spheres of life. In its fullest sense, self-reliance is much more than freedom from all restraints. It is self-rule and self-restraint. Sorry. So they're weaving the roof and they're weaving at the same time. Both those activities you can see are happening at the same time. I'm sharing these last images. These are actually images taken on the 11th of February this year. And this is actually the time of, so these images are taken during full moon. There's no other light but the light of the moon. So you can see the shadows. That's why you see the shadows in the way they are. All these pictures have actually been taken at night. And for me, it was very interesting right from the beginning, just to ask the question that, what if, what we do, or buildings that we make can emit their own light, and this afternoon we were talking about this idea. For me, I'm interested in making buildings that mimic ourselves as closely as possible. So for me, what's important is that the idea that the build or these projects emerge from the ground and can return back to the ground. They're porous, they're full of air, water, and light, and gravity is acting on them. But yes, this potential of, or the idea that buildings can emit their own light, just in the way that we can emit light. Angle of repose, the angle of maximum slope at which a heap of any loose solid material will remain in place without sliding. State of rest. So I want to leave you with this. For me, the ingredients of what, for me, makes architecture basically is water, air, light, posture, affection, manner, and gravity. Thank you.